Good morning. Today we're going to be talking about Linux. Linux is an operating system just like Windows or Mac OS. It has a graphical user interface and software that you are accustomed to with other operating systems. An operating system is simply basically an interface between the human user who would use the application software and the hardware of the system. For example, an operating system would be responsible for doing things like allocating RAM. So let's say, for instance, that you're going to use Microsoft Word as a piece of software. So when you open Microsoft Word, it requires 128 megabytes of RAM to run. So the systems inside Microsoft Word, or the instructions inside Microsoft Word, would go through the operating system and say, hey, allocate 128 megabytes of RAM to run. And the operating system would be the system responsible for allocating that RAM. Linux was developed in 1991 by a man named Linus Torvalds. Originally, Linux was supposed to be called Freaks, but was named Linux as a combination of Torvalds' first name and Unix. Unix was developed to be an operating system that anyone can see and edit as an open source system. The code for Linux is open source, and over the years there have been many derivations of it. And so Linux, even though it is of the three big operating systems, it's the least used, it's getting more and more play every day. So what is open source? Open source is this idea that software should be free. Free in the sense that we should be able to look inside it. Developers should be able to take the code and adjust it in the ways that they want and modify it. And then when the modifications are done, those modifications should be freely distributed throughout the computing community. So this idea of open source has its grounds in the idea that science, knowledge, should be freely spread. So having an open source operating system and allowing things to be built on it and allowing this modification is intended as a way to increase knowledge and innovation. So anyone can contribute to Linux as if they want to, because it's open source. It's written in the C language with some assembly and other languages. And you can actually go to this website, kernelnewbies.org, and to find out how you can begin contributing to Linux. So if you're not a hardcore programmer, the community also needs designers, testers, writers, and translators. So you never know, you might be able to help contribute to a really neat operating system, or set of operating systems, I should say. Okay, Linux is used widespread. Mobile devices it's used on. In fact, the Android phones are developed on a Linux kernel, and it's also used by large companies. Large companies usually use it for their back-end, their systems administration, and making sure that people can, do file systems and that sort of thing. Okay, so Linux has, because it's open source and because there's 1 major myth about Linux is that it's too difficult for ordinary people to use. That may be in the case originally when it was first designed for those with computer expertise, but over time, Linux has changed, and because of its open source, people have opened it up, modified it, created different distributions of Linux. And now there's so many distros that have the GUI that's similar to Mac and Windows. It's actually very user-friendly. Another myth about Linux is that it's insecure. Actually, it is far more secure, resistant to viruses and worms, because it's frequently inspected by security people all over the world. So it basically secures itself in its development. Another myth that it's not worth bothering to learn Linux because most companies use MS Windows. While that might be true, Linux is being used more and more by companies, and one thing that actually the main thing that's stopping the growth of Linux is the shortage of people trained in setting up and administering systems. So it is a worthwhile skill to have, and in fact Linux systems admin people with Linux experience actually garner more pay. Linux, another myth would be Linux cannot have much of a future because it's free, and thus there's no way businesses can profit from it. So that's creating the assumption that people are motivated by money only. But Linux isn't always completely free. It's often bundled with other software and services, so that there's some payment to do that. But when you think of free in terms of Linux, you want to think of it less about money and more about open. That anyone can open it and they can look inside the code, they can modify the code, they can use the code in other things, and then pass those modifications on and share those modifications. In fact, one company, IBM, has invested more than $1 billion in a Linux platform, and they're making huge profits from that. So, another myth about Linux is that since it's free, then that's a form of software piracy. But that's not really true. Linux contains all original source code, and in fact, much of the most popular commercial software now that people pay for was originally developed at public expense at universities around the country, around the world. Another myth would be that there are few application programs available for Linux, when the truth is there are thousands of applications available for Linux, and many of those applications are actually free to use. So that's another big benefit of Linux. And another myth would be that Linux has poor support because there's no single company behind it, but rather just a bunch of hackers and amateurs. Actually, because Linux is developed in that community model, support is readily available because you can go online to the different support areas like Stack Overflow or other Linux support, and enter your problem, and then pretty quickly you're going to have an answer that that's free for you. There's also blogs and archives and that sort of thing where you can look up common bugs. But there's actually commercial support available. In other words, you could pay for support for Linux. Okay, so how to install it? Basically, installing Linux is very easy. First thing you do is you choose a distribution that you would like. In fact, you can go to this website and it can, it has a bunch of descriptions of the different distros that are available. So once you choose one that you like, you download it. You create a bootable CD, DVD, or USB flash drive, and then boot the media on the destination and make a few decisions regarding installation, and pretty soon you'll be up and running Linux. Create a new machine. Typical. Browse to your images. We're going to CentOS OS. Open. Next. Name the machine. So now we're going to set it up in VMware. First of all, we're going to choose English as our language. Then we're going to go to the date and time and make sure that it is in the same time zone as we are. We're in New York. We're going to have an English keyboard. We want to look at the installation source, the software selection. In here, maybe select Known GUI if you want a GUI user interface. You don't necessarily have to do this right now, but I like to do it because I like a GUI interface. And checking all the other tools that you might want. Click Done. Okay, then we're going to check the settings. Look at the installation destination. So we're going to automatically configure. KDump is pretty meaningless right now, so we just select it and make sure that it's done. You want to select the software. Okay, next we're going to do a password for our root user. The root is like the main administrator. It's the user that can do anything to the system, so you always have to be very careful with root. And now we're going to create another user. You can name it anything you want. This will be where you create new users all the time, except for, of course, when we do it on the command line, but we'll do that later. We're going to make this user an administrator, give them a strong password. Click Done. And then we're going to click in the lower right to reload and reboot. Sign back into the system. Let it load, do its thing. Okay, this gray screen shows a little bit of success. Finally, we're getting to where we need to accept the license. Let's go down and check it. So now that we have everything set up in your machine, in the virtual machine or VMware, what we're going to do is we're actually going to go into the CentOS 7 virtual machine. So you do that by going over here in your library and you click on CentOS 7. These are all virtual machines that I have loaded up on this machine, on this VMware. I could use any of these. I could use all of them at once. I can connect them together and interact with them, and that's the power of the VMware. So once you click on it over in your library, you have this splash screen come up. And all you have to do is press play, power on your virtual machine. So it takes a couple minutes to come up. So everything starts. You can press enter. If you click inside your the black screen, and then your mouse is inside here. As you can see, my mouse kind of flying up. If you get here and your mouse seems to be lost in the darkness, you can click Control and Alt and you can come out of that. So it does take a couple minutes for the virtual machine to boot up. So we're going to pause for just a second and come back. So once the machine is started, your screen will show all the users that you have put on your system. My main user is Susan Grasso, so I'm going to click on that. And then I enter my password, sign in, so once I sign in and boot up, you'll notice that the Linux machine that I have here, I've set up a GUI on it, so it looks very similar to a regular, say, Windows desktop. In fact, I'm going to flip over to my Windows desktop and show you a little bit. See, the Windows desktop is just like this, with files and then any kind of shortcuts that I have. So big scary Linux should be very familiar to you, actually. There's one thing that's very different in Linux that I've learned as working with this, is that most things that you want to do, that you're going to do in Linux, at least in the server environment, is through the terminal. So it's going to be very important for us to learn a lot of terminal commands and that sort of thing. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to look into the terminal and do some commands and see what happens. Okay, so I simply click on here, and when it pops up, I have my terminal, and basically what this shows is that this user, and this is the name of my machine, and I'm in the home directory. So let's just pop through a couple of commands to familiarize you with what we have here. Okay, so one command is ls. ls, all it does is it lists the files in the directory that you are working on. So if I go cd and look at my desktop, which is anything in blue here is actually a directory. It's kind of like a folder in Windows. And inside the folder can be other folders and other files. So CD basically means change directory. So what I'm going to look at is I'm going to go inside my desktop. So when I press enter, it shows, hey, you're inside your desktop. But notice it doesn't show anything, but which is kind of odd because if you looked at your Windows desktop and you have all the of course I have a lot of files and stuff on my Windows desktop. Any shortcuts and that sort of thing are also listed, but that's not the case here in my Linux machine. So it doesn't do that. So instead of being on my desktop, I'm just going to change directories to my files. Maybe I have something in there. Okay, well, so I just made the cardinal sin of dealing with directories. So if you're sitting inside a directory, you can't just change files backwards, basically up in the file system. So what you have to do is you have to go backwards. So you can do that by doing cd space ... And what you notice is I went backwards all the way back to my home directory. And if I do ls there, okay, you'll see all the directories that are inside there. So if now I do cd my files, okay, and then I do the ls command to list the files that are in there, I have one file. Okay, now the next thing I want to do is I want to read what's inside that file. And there's a couple of ways I can do that. One way is I can use the command cat file1.txt. Okay, and then of course I just made this one up, so it just says this is the text inside my file. So another command that you can do, of course, that I have the file. So let's just take a look at it. So I'm in my files and I have file1.txt. And if I want to actually add a bit of information to the text, all I have to do is do the command echo, and then add something, a string, close the string, and then do greater than signs together, and then name, say, the file that I want to do it with. Okay, and then if I actually look at that file, here we go. Say this is the text inside my file, add some more text to file 1, and then this is what I just put in there. So another thing that I can do is actually add a new file, and the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to use a text editor called Vim or Vim. So basically I'm still inside my files folder, and then I'm going to do Vim, and I'm going to do file2.txt, and then I should go enter. And then look here, what I am is I'm inside my Vim text editor, and I press the letter I, and notice I can say insert. Okay, and then I'm simply going to say this is file 2. I can edit from my Vim text editor. Now, the value of having a text editor so easily available to you on the Linux, in the Linux terminal, is that sometimes, and we'll learn about this later, sometimes you want to do Python scripts to do a series of functions. Let's say you want to create a Python script that creates a new folder and puts certain files inside of it if you're doing some sort of database work or something like that. So you can do that. So once I've edited my file and I want to save it, basically what I do is I press Escape, WQ. Notice that that's happening down here. You can see that down here. The W means write, the Q means quit. Write means save, basically. Okay, so after I've done that, I press enter. And now let's take a look at file2.txt. Okay, and you'll notice that this is file 2. I can edit from my Vim text editor. Okay, so what if I wanted, another way to create files is by using the keyword touch. So I'm going to create file 3 and file 4. So notice I can use my command touch, and then as long as I'm just creating the file names one after the other. So once I do that and I ls, so now I have file 1, file 2, file 3, file 4. Now notice file 3. So if we do cat file3.txt, okay, so there's nothing in there yet. So let's just go over this again. If I want to add some text, if I simply have a very short sentence or something like that, so I'll write here is file 3, okay. And then I want to do that to file3.txt. Okay, and now if I actually I'm going to show you another way of doing this. If you press your up arrow, what you're going to see is you can go through the commands that you've done. Excellent shortcut, because sometimes this gets crazy, all these commands that you need to do over and over again. So let's take a look at file 3. And look at there. File 3 is doing that. Alright, so another way I can access file 3 is I'm going to open it in the Vim text editor. So I simply type vi file3.txt. And look, here I am inside there. I press the I to insert, and this text editor is a little bit different. Instead of using your mouse, you use your arrows and stuff like that. So this is an addition to file 3.txt. Okay, again, escape, WQ. And notice it's happening down here. Okay, this is how you get out of the file. Alright, and then if I want to, let me go back to our shortcuts, up arrow, up arrow. So this is an addition to file 3. Alright, so those are just a few of file manipulation commands that I wanted to introduce to you today. Let's pause for a couple minutes and we'll come back and look at some other things. So next I'm going to show you just a little bit of navigation around inside your folder system. So right here, this indication shows me, okay, so this is my username, this is the computer that I'm on, I named it that, and then this is the directory that I'm sitting in. And if I want to see what's inside that directory, I do ls, and it shows me what's inside. Another way I can do that is ll. So ll gives me what's called metadata. So the metadata basically says So the first three letters here, or the first three characters here, talk about, what the permissions of this file. So this is the permissions for the owner. The owner is right here. So S. Grasso is the owner. That means that I logged in and I created those. And what it means is, first of all, that these are files, okay? So not directories. So if I were to create a directory, which I'll do in a minute, this would have a D. We'll go over that in a minute. The R means that I have read privileges and write privileges. Okay? But this dash right here, if there were an X there, it would mean I would have execute privileges. Now this is just a text file, so it's not even, doesn't even have that option. Now, people in my group, okay,